Welcome to the last section of Chapter 2. So in this we're going to do a brief rundown of chemical reactions, kind of what's happening in them and what's the driving force behind them. And then we're going to talk about chemical reactions specifically in human cells or in cells in general. Okay. So now you might be thinking, hey, this is biology, this isn't chemistry. But biology really only works because chemical reactions are taking place. Okay, so there are thousands and thousands of chemical reactions that take place every second inside a single cell, right? So it's important to at least have a general understanding of what chemical reactions are and how they kind of work. So a chemical reaction is something that happens, a change that takes place when one or more substance or substances changes into different ones. So you can have two different substances combining to create one. You can have one substance breaking apart to create several others. And then you can also have two or more substances kind of swapping pieces, basically, in order to create new compounds. So you're going to have some compounds going in, and then you're going to get different compounds coming out of the chemical reaction. So during a chemical reaction, basically it's going to have to break most, if not all, of the chemical bonds in the substances that are going into the reaction. So it'll break those bonds and then it'll reform other ones. Okay. So the reactants, those are the substances that go into the reaction. So they're like the before picture basically, and then you get the products or the after picture. Okay, so reactants are changed, they go into the reaction, and then products come out of the reaction. Generally, the reactants are written on the left side of the reaction, and then the products are written on the right side. So when you talk about breaking chemical bonds, you have to talk about bond energy. So really, the specific bond energy of a chemical bond depends on what two elements are bonded together, how closely they're bonded, if it's a double, triple bond, anything like that. But the general definition of bond energy is just the amount of energy that's needed to break a bond. Okay? And so each individual bond will get its own bond energy, and then all of that together determines how much energy you have to put in to the compound itself in order to break all of the chemical bonds. Okay. So energy has to be added to break bonds, and then energy will be released when bonds form. Now, believe it or not, this is actually kind of a fight between biologists and chemists. This is the chemical perspective. Energy is added to break bonds, and energy is released when bonds form. Biologists point to one particular substance that we're going to get very familiar with later on called ATP. ATP is a very high energy molecule, and when a single bond on it is broken, it actually releases energy. Okay, so that is a very strange case, but yes, it actually has caused some fights in the past when you're talking to biologists or chemists. It's a weird thing. Completely admit that. But okay, so some chemical reactions are reversible. You might think of things like a combustion reaction where you're burning something. You're not going to be able to reverse that. Okay, so that might be what you kind of think in your head when you think about chemical reactions. But most of them actually try to find a balance between the reactants and the products. So this balance is called equilibrium. So equilibrium is when the reactants and the products form at the same rate. This doesn't mean that you're going to have the same amounts of both. Okay? The reaction may favor more reactants than products. So you'll have a lot more reactants than you will products, but it's going back and forth where you have reactants forming products and then products forming reactants at the same rate. Okay, so basically if you lose two reactants to gain two products, you'll also gain two products to gain two reactants. Okay, so it's keeping that even. Okay. So this is an example of a reversible reaction here, and you'll note the double-sided arrow. It's right here. Okay, that is what tells you that it's reversible. So the forward direction would have these as your reactants, your CO2 and your H2O, and then your H2CO3 as your product. The backwards reaction would have the H2CO3 as your reactant, and then the carbon dioxide and water as your products. Okay, but this one, it can go either way. It just depends on the circumstances of the reaction. Right? All right. So when you're talking about chemical reactions, you also have to talk about how the reaction takes place. So this is where activation energy comes in. The activation energy is the amount of energy that's needed to kind of kickstart the chemical reaction. Okay? So this is what I was talking about earlier with you have to break the chemical bonds in order to form new ones. You actually have to put energy into the substance in order to start breaking some of those bonds so that you can react things. Okay, so this energy has to be absorbed by the reactants. And the reaction can actually still have a net release of energy. It just depends on what chemical bonds are formed after this activation energy is reached or added. Okay, so this shows, basically it's kind of depicted as a hill. Okay, so you have inherent energy in every substance, and so that's what this is showing here. You've got your reactants that have kind of a baseline energy to start off with. But then in order to get them to react, you actually have to put energy in and start breaking some of those chemical bonds. So this line here is showing you the increase in energy over time. Okay? And then once it reaches that activation energy, that's when you've added enough energy to break enough of those chemical bonds that the reaction can take place. Okay, so again, oftentimes this is kind of depicted as a person pushing like a boulder or something up a hill. Okay, once you get to the top of the hill, you know that the reaction, or the ball in this case, is just going to go ahead and roll down the hill on the other side. But you have to get it up to the top of that in order to get that going. Okay, so there are two different types of reactions in terms of energy. So you have what's known as an exothermic reaction. So in an exothermic reaction, you're going to have a net release of energy. You still have to add energy into the reaction to get it started, but once it gets going, it's going to pay you back with interest. Okay, so you're going to get more energy out than you had to put in. So your reactants are going to have a higher bond energy, a higher inherent energy than the products will. So the excess energy is usually released as heat, sometimes as light, sometimes other things like that. But if you have something that is releasing heat, generally that is an exothermic reaction. It's a good sign that it's exothermic. So in this case, okay, this is what you'll see with this reaction diagram here. Okay, so you saw the 1/2 of this diagram on the last page where we added the energy in order to reach the peak of this energy diagram, and we've now reached, or we've added in the activation energy. Okay, so now the reactants are at the point where they can actually start to react. All right, they've got enough energy in them to go ahead and react. So once you reach that peak of the hill, then you're going to start rolling down the hill. Okay, so at this point you're releasing energy from these compounds. And then once you get to the bottom, this is the inherent energy contained within the products. Okay, now easy way to notice if this is exothermic, or in the next slide we'll see endothermic, is the products have a lower inherent energy than your reactants do. Okay, so you've actually had a net release of energy. So it's the difference from the products up to this line where the reactants were. Okay, so you've released this amount of energy. All right, So say if this were 25 kilojoules of energy and this were 30 kilojoules, okay, you would have released those 5 kilojoules of energy. All right. Now, endothermic is the exact opposite. With an endothermic reaction, you have a net absorption of energy. So you're giving up more than you're getting out in terms of energy. So your reactants are going to have a lower bond energy, lower inherent energy than the products. Okay, so energy can be absorbed from the surroundings. Sometimes it can be absorbed from you, like if you're holding an ice cube in your hand, it feels cold because it's absorbing energy from your hand. Okay, and that's how it's melting, right? So in this case, you'll notice that really the only difference here is that the products are now higher than the reactants on the scale of energy. Okay, so now you've actually absorbed that energy instead of releasing more energy than you took in. Okay, so you still have your activation energy going up, okay, but now your little downward hill is shorter. Okay, so you're actually releasing less energy than you took in. So again, the absorption of energy is calculated based on the difference between the energy of the products and the energy of the reactants. So if this were at 40 kilojoules here at the products and this were still at 30 kilojoules, you would have absorbed 10 kilojoules. So 10 kilojoules of energy would have been lost from the surroundings in order to be absorbed by the reaction. Okay? Alright, so there is a way that you can actually speed up these reactions. Okay, they're called catalysts. So sometimes this you get more into when you go into chemistry, but the rate of the reaction really depends on the reaction itself and how much energy is necessary to activate the reaction. Okay. So there are ways that you can speed up these reactions. We do talk about this in biology because if we didn't have catalysts, which are the substances that speed up these chemical reactions, you wouldn't have hardly any chemical reactions going on in your body, which means that you'd be dead. I mean, yeah. Okay? So when you talk about catalyst, there is a specific type of biological catalyst called an enzyme, which we'll get to in a little bit. But catalysts, the way they work is they decrease the activation energy. So it's basically like, you remember that example with the guy pushing a ball up or a boulder up the hill? It's basically like you came in with something and like knocked the top of the hill off. Okay, so now he has less distance that he has to push that boulder up the hill. Okay, it increases the reaction rate simply because the reaction doesn't have to absorb as much energy in order to get that kickstart. So it looks like this. So if you had, this is your uncatalyzed reaction where you're going all the way up to the peak here, and this is your activation energy, you've got a lot more energy that the reactants have to absorb in order to start reacting. Now, if you look at the catalyzed reaction, there are a couple things that you'll know. First, the reactants have the same inherent energy, so you're not changing that. And then the products also have the same inherent energy. Okay, so all that it's changing is the slope of the hill that you have to get over. Okay, so you lower your activation energy, making it easier and faster for the reactants to absorb that energy and get their little kickstart to start working. Okay, now this actually has a huge impact on biology. Okay, like I said, we would not be alive if we did not have these catalysts. Okay, so this is an incredibly important part of biological chemical reactions. Okay, but we are actually going to stop here for a sec and go to the second video.